One of the most shocking and surmising moments in European history saw the French people rise up against their monarchy. The French Revolution was a ruthless period in which thousands of people were dragged to the guillotine for their executions. Even the French king and queen had their heads taken off on the slanted bladed execution device. But there were more people who were condemned. But in the years following their deaths, many of these people, including King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, had their graves broken into and their corpses dug up and disinterred. In this documentary, we look at some of those people who had their coffins broken into during this volatile period of time. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. In the months before, her husband, King Louis XVI, had been executed on the same device at the same place, and many did not know what to do with the Queen following her husband's execution. Some were in favour of exiling her, and others would have preferred to see her left to rot in prison, as she was a staunch and strong symbol of hatred across the nation. She was hated massively and had little remorse for the French people who were starving. But following the Queen's execution, what happened to her head and also her body? Marie Antoinette was tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal on the 14th of October 1793. It is believed that she was already condemned to death when she was brought to trial, and her lawyers were given not long to sort out her defence. She was accused with a huge amount of charges, including sending millions of lives to Austria, planning a massacre, incest, and declaring her son to be the new French king. But Marie Antoinette was on the 16th of October declared guilty of the three main charges: depleting the national treasury, conspiracy against the security of the state, and high treason. Her lawyers were shocked, as they thought she would just have a prison sentence, but the court sentenced her to death. In preparation for her execution, Marie was forced to change clothes in front of her guards, and she was ordered to wear a plain white dress. Her hair had been cut by guards in preparation for the guillotine, and it was cut short, and her hands were tied behind her back, and she was put on a rope lead before she was then taken from her prison to the execution scaffold on an open cart. It was an undignified end for the former Queen of France, and the people of Paris jeered at her as she passed in the cart, and it took an hour for the convoy to get to the place de la Revolution, where the guillotine sat. Whilst this was happening, she was noted to have been rather calm, as the court screamed obscenities and hatred at her, and her priest sat next to Marie in the cart, but she ignored him throughout her final journey. She arrived at the guillotine on the 16th of October 1793 at 12:15 p.m, and she was led up the steps of the scaffold. The former queen stood on the foot of the executioner, and her final words were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." The executioner then fastened her to the wooden board, and then quickly slid Marie under the guillotine before he released the blade, and her head was taken clean off in one go by the device. But what happened to her body after this? You see, her head would have been grabbed from the basket where it fell, and it was then displayed to the crowd. One painting of this event shows the Queen's head on a pike, but it shows for certain that following her execution, that the Queen's body and also her head was taken to the Madeleine cemetery nearby, and that it was thrown in an unmarked grave. At the time, Madame Tussaud would, whilst the gravediggers were on a lunch break, sneak into the cemetery and would take a cast of Marie Antoinette's head following her beheading. But this would not be the end of the story of the Queen's body and head, as in 1814, at the orders of King Louis XVIII, an inquiry was launched to locate the body of Marie Antoinette. Her husband, King Louis XVI's body was located, and the exhumations took place in the presence of many ministers and court officials on the 18th of January 1815. The Queen's remains were found on this day, and the King's would be found on the following day. Marie's grave was found rather easily, and a layer of quicklime had solidified over the coffin, and this allowed her remains to be preserved. Many of her bones were found, including her skull, which was said to have been intact. Workers also found a woman's stocking similar to one that the Queen was given in her imprisonment, and many people were moved by the location of Marie Antoinette's remains. Some prayed by the gravesite, and one official even fainted. The workers placed the bones and personal items inside a couple of chests, and they were then moved to a chapel where they were surrounded by lit candles. It's never been established completely that these were the correct bodies that were found, and some historians are sceptical as they believed that the cemetery was very full. But the preservation of Marie's remains would have happened if the quicklime did solidify. The location of Marie's body is believed could have been marked with a cross on the wall near to it, and it was clear that the coffin she had been placed in was still intact. The hair also belonged to a woman that was found along with the clothes as mentioned, which were similar to what Marie was executed in. Following this, they were then prepared to be buried in the royal vault in the Basilica of St. Denis. The interring of these royal remains took place on the 21st of January, and one eyewitness described the procession and the proceedings. He said, "A detachment of artillery joined the procession at the barrier St. Denis and followed it, firing minute guns. A regiment of the King's chasseurs lined the road from Paris to St. Denis. The drums and musical instruments were covered with black serge, and the arms and the colours of the troops were ornamented with crape. A deep and solemn silence prevailed among the multitudes who thronged the streets and road by which the procession passed." Upon reaching the church of St. Denis, the bodies were taken from the cart by the Gardes de la Manche and carried into the church, where they were received by the clergy and presented by the Bishop of Carcassonne to the Bishop of Aire. They were then placed upon a lofty tomb of state in the midst of the choir. Monsieur, after retiring for a few minutes, entered the church and was followed by the Duke of Angoulême, the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Orléans, and the Prince de Conde, who occupied the stalls on the right nearest to the altar. The Duchess of Orléans, the Duchess of Bourbon, and Mademoiselle of Orléans entered the opposite stalls. Next to the Prince sat the Duke of Dalmatia, the Duke of Reggio, Count Bartholomew, and M. Lane, whom the King had appointed to support the pall when the coffins were carried to the vault. The other stalls were occupied by deputations from the court of Castillon, the court of Amcops, and the council of the university, the Cour Royale, the municipality, the Tribunal de Premier Instance. The choir was filled by the great officers of the King's household, the officers of the Prince's household, His Majesty's ministers, the high personages appointed to form part of the procession, the marshals and peers of France, the deputies of the departments, the grand crosses of the offer of the Major General and staff of the National Guards, the governor of the 1st Military Division and his staff, and a great number of generals and other military officers. The governess of the royal children, the ladies-in-waiting upon her late Majesty, and the ladies-in-waiting upon the Duchess of Angoulême sat upon benches near the coffins. 400 young ladies of the Maison Royale St. Denis were seated in front of the altar. When all these attendants had taken their places, the service commenced. The princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master and Master of the Ceremonies, and their assistants, approached the altar to present their offerings, after which a funeral operation was delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. The absolution having been pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the royal vault, into which Monsieur and 2 princes and his sons descended, and prostrated themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Salutes of artillery were fired at the moment when the procession set out from Paris, during the service of St. Denis, and when the bodies were lowered into the vault. To perpetuate the memory of these august victims, the King had ordained that solemn funeral services shall be performed annually in all the churches of the kingdom on the 21st of January for the repose of the soul of Louis XVI, and on the 16th of October for all that of his royal consort, and that on those days the court shall wear mourning, and the public offices, courts of justice, exchange and theatres be closed. It was a huge moment in history, as the remains of the executed French king and queen, a couple of decades after their execution, were exhumed, and they were then given a burial befitting their status. Still, at this time, Marie Antoinette was considered a controversial figure, and she is remembered in history as a woman who was very frivolous and who had very little sympathy for her subjects. Robespierre rose to the position of the President of the National Convention, but his short period in control was terrifying. He was known for his position as a member of the Committee of Public Safety, and he believed that following the overthrow of the monarchy, that terror was essential to stomp out any form of pro-monarchist sentiment. He wanted to make sure that no one questioned the revolution and his ideas, and because of this, thousands of people were executed. Even the wives of executed men were dragged to the guillotine after the tears they shed for their beloved, who had lost his head minutes before, were considered anti-revolutionary. It was a very dangerous time inside of France, and the terror ramped up under Robespierre's oversight, and he was acting like a perverse and sadistic dictator. He ordered the National Convention to bring in a huge change to religion in France, and to instigate a new religion known as the cult of the Supreme Being. However, due to the horror inside of France, Robespierre was universally disliked, and he would become a figure of hatred. He was eventually arrested, and within a day, the injured Robespierre was put to death, and he was executed. He had been conspired against by rebels to bring him down, and he was brought to his execution on the 28th of July 1794 inside of Paris. One person who witnessed his execution stated that at 4 p.m, the sinister procession moved out of the courtyard of the Palais de Justice. No crowd of such a size had ever been seen in Paris. The streets were choked with people. Spectators, men and women of all ages, filled every window, and men had climbed onto the rooftops. There was a universal jubilation, coupled with popular fury. The long-suppressed hatred against these criminals now exploded with double force. Everyone applauded wildly and seemed to be sorry they could not do more. Most of the watchers fixed their gaze on the cart in which Robespierre, his brother, Caution and Henrot were riding. These miserable creatures were all mutilated and covered with blood. They looked like a band of brigands the gendarmes had surprised in the forest and were unable to arrest without inflicting serious wounds upon them. It would be difficult to describe the appearance of Robespierre. His face was wrapped in a bandage of dirty, blood-stained linen. His features were horribly disfigured. A pale pallor made it even more repulsive. He kept his eyes downwards and almost closed. Whether that was from the pain of his wounds or an awareness of his misdeeds, one cannot say. Just before arriving at the place of execution, Robespierre was shaken out of his lethargy by a woman who forced her way through the crowd and rushed up to the cart carrying this cannibal. She grasped the cart rail with one hand and threatened Robespierre with the other, saying, "Monster spewed from hell! The thought of your punishment intoxicates me with joy." Robespierre opened his eyes and looked sadly as she said, "Go now, evildoer, go down into your grave, carrying the curses of the wives and mothers of France." When the cart had reached the foot of the scaffold, the executioners carried the tyrant down and laid him out prone until it was his turn for execution. While his accomplices were being beheaded, Robespierre appeared to not be taking notice. He kept his eyes shut and did not open them until he himself was carried up the scaffold. Some said that when he saw the instrument of death, he heaved a sigh of pain. But before dying, he had to endure bitter suffering. After having thrown down his coat, the The executioner roughly tore away the bandage and splint which the surgeon had put on his wounds. This unhinged his lower jaw from the upper jaw and caused the blood to flow in torrents. The wretched man's head was now no more than an object of horror and repulsion. When at last it was severed from his body, and the executioner held it by the hair to show to the people, it presented an indescribable, horrible sight. Thus perished the fiercest of the savage beasts, the most monstrous criminal that nature ever conceived. On the 2 days that followed, 83 other rebels were put to death, mainly members of the Commune or their outlawed accomplices. His head had been taken clean off, and with this Madame Tussaud was ordered to create a death mask of Robespierre, and she took a cast of his head after it had been taken off. She moulded this at the foot of the guillotine, and then created a wax head of the tyrant from this. Tussaud had also done this with the French Queen Marie Antoinette, but the people were incredibly angry after Robespierre's execution, and there was a fear that his body would be ripped to pieces. Because of this, there were conditions put in place to stop the public accessing his corpse, and his remains were taken to the Arancis cemetery in Paris. And they were not buried in an individual grave, but his head and body were placed inside of a mass grave. Many people who were buried in this cemetery were those who had lost their heads on the guillotine during Robespierre's terror, but the architect of the bloodshed would also be buried here. As the revolution continued, the cemetery where Robespierre was buried became very full, and with this further burial grounds were searched for. But many of the bodies within the cemetery were in a bad way, and their identities could not be worked out when they were exhumed. The restored king, King Louis XVII, even looked for his sister, but he could not find her body. Inside of the Arancis cemetery, Robespierre was exhumed during the clean-up of the graveyards, and along with hundreds of other people's corpses, his bones and remains were dug up, and they were then taken to the catacombs of Paris. Underground, these ossuaries would hold the remains of around 6 million people, and lots of these were those who had been guillotined during the French Revolution. Robespierre's remains are inside of the catacombs somewhere, but his remains have yet to have been located, and it would be practically impossible to find them due to the sheer amount of bones in the catacombs. But discovered inside of the walls of a chapel in Paris are a set of remains that some have claimed belonged to Robespierre, and some of these makeshift coffins are covered in leather, and it's believed that these contain the bones of important people. Robespierre was one of the most ruthless leaders in European history, and his popularity quickly went downhill as he would order the guillotined executions of thousands of people. He was someone who was involved in a shootout before he too was arrested and executed. But still, the remains of Robespierre today are probably missing under the feet of many inside of Paris who pass over the catacombs every day. Now Elizabeth was born on the 3rd of May 1764, and she was the youngest child of the Dauphin of France, Louis. Her grandparents were King Louis XV and the Queen Maria. However, after her father died suddenly in 1765, when she was just a year old, Elizabeth's older brother Louis became the heir to the French throne and the Dauphin. Her mother died in 1767, and then she was left an orphan at a young age, and Elizabeth was raised by her governess. She and her sister were very different, and Elizabeth was a proud and passionate child, and she was given a great education fit for a princess. It's believed that one day she would go on to marry a royal from another European country to secure alliances for France. Elizabeth learnt many subjects, including history, botany and religion, and she was an active child, often seen walking in the royal parks. But she did fall out of love with her education, and in 1770 her older brother, the Dauphin, married Princess Marie Antoinette, of Austria, and Marie said that the young Elizabeth was delightful and lovely. Marie Antoinette claimed, "My sister Elizabeth is a charming child, who has intelligence, character, and much grace. She showed the greatest feeling, and much above her age, and the departure of her sister. The poor little girl was in despair, and as her health is very delicate, she was taken ill, and had a very severe nervous attack. I own to my dear mamma that I feel I am getting too attached to her, feeling from the example of my aunts how essential it is for her happiness not to remain an old maid in this country." When her grandfather died on the 10th of May 1774, and her brother then became King Louis XVI, Elizabeth left the children's quarters in 1778, and she was given her own household as a princess. There were marriage arrangements which were ordered for Elizabeth, and she was linked to many men, including a prince of Brazil and the future king of Sardinia. A marriage was agreed between her and her sister's brother-in-law, Joseph II, the Holy Roman Emperor. He claimed that he was attracted to her, but at court there were people who were against this, and the arrangements did not go much further. Elizabeth later claimed that "I can only marry a king's son, and a king's son must reign over his father's kingdom. I should no longer be a Frenchwoman. I do not wish to cease to be one. It is far better to stay here at the foot of my brother's throne than to ascend to another." She was viewed as a lesser royal, and even during the French Revolution she was seen as someone who was not too dangerous. Elizabeth shunned the grandeur of court, and she distanced herself from it, and she only went to court when it was needed. She didn't spend huge sums of money, unlike Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, but she did respect her brother. Elizabeth stood by him at difficult times, but she did grow apart from Marie Antoinette. They were very different people, and Elizabeth chose to be closer to her aunts, who dissented against Marie Antoinette at court, and they did not get on with her at all. Elizabeth began to also criticise Marie and her behaviour, which was causing further suffering to the French people. She lived a luxurious life and was given land and houses by King Louis, and she enjoyed a life of gardening, and also Elizabeth donated to local people and allowed for charity. She gave food to the locals from her farms. However, as the French Revolution broke out, Elizabeth refused to leave France when she probably should have. She advised her brother to put down the riots quickly, and she saw many different events, such as the storming of the Bastille and the Women's March on Versailles. At the time, she returned to the royal palaces to support her brother. During the march on Versailles, the mob stormed the palace and they tried to assassinate the Queen, and Elizabeth remained with the royal family, travelling to Paris. She was housed in apartments next to the Queen, but one evening a woman climbed into her apartments, and Princess Elizabeth spoke to her, and she was respected. She was viewed very differently to Marie Antoinette, the Queen, but she decided to remain in France. There was a brief escape attempt, but this did not work. Elizabeth knew that the royal family was beginning to become a target, and that it would crumble. There was a belief that there would be an attack inside the palace, but she witnessed her brothers abdicate the throne. After this, Elizabeth was calm, but following the execution of the king, her brother, Elizabeth was left with Marie Antoinette under house arrest. When they were split up, she knew that Marie would be executed too on the guillotine. Marie wrote her last letter to Elizabeth, but this was never given to her. Elizabeth herself, being a princess, was also brought to trial, and she was viewed as not dangerous by Robespierre, the leader of the period of time that came next, known as the Terror. They planned to banish her from France, but she was then accused of having secret meetings with Marie Antoinette, and in this it was claimed that she conspired against the French people. It was claimed in court that she also sold her jewels to fund the war that would bring harm to the French, and Elizabeth knew this was false. She was then escorted and held in a single prison cell, and she refused a public defender and was tried along with 24 others, including 10 women. During her trial, she was accused of being against the revolution, and the princess was sentenced to death for mostly just being the sister of the king. Her death sentence was viewed as shocking and unfair, and she was to be executed upon the guillotine. After the trial, Elizabeth and the other condemned people were taken to the hall of the condemned to await their execution. She comforted others who were weeping and crying, and it was claimed that she spoke to them with inexpressible gentleness and calm, dominating their mental suffering by the serenity of her look, the tranquillity of her appearance, and the influence of her words. She was then executed alongside 23 men and women who had all been sentenced to death at the same time as her. She was then taken to the Place de la Révolution in Paris, and as she approached the guillotine, the white cloth which covered her head blew off in the wind. At the foot of the guillotine, there was a bench for the condemned to wait their turn before they were executed. Elizabeth left the cart first and made her way down, and she was the last to be executed. She had to witness the blade fall many times before it was her time, which must have been torture for her. One woman bowed to her as she went onto the scaffold, and she helped others through their ordeals. She was then summoned onto the scaffold, and the executioner strapped her to the tilting board, and her shoulders were exposed. And with this, Princess Elizabeth said, "In the name of your mother, cover me." But then the blade was released upon her neck, and then her head was taken off, and there was a sigh across the crowd. The people of France knew that she was not a tyrant, but instead she was a caring woman. Now, after her death, Princess Elizabeth of France's head and body were taken from the guillotine to the Arancis cemetery in Paris. This was a place where many thousands of people who lost their heads on the guillotine were buried. Grave diggers had prepared a large grave for her and the other people's remains to be interred inside, and the head and corpse of the princess was then thrown into this mass grave. But then, decades later, during the brief restoration of the monarchy, Elizabeth's brother, Louis XVIII, searched for her body and remains, and there was a call to give her a decent burial inside of the royal mausoleum, the Basilica of St. Denis. The search to locate Elizabeth's remains was vast, but the bodies in the cemetery had been covered in quicklime, and when the graves were opened, it was found that the remains were unrecognisable, and they were so badly decomposed they could not be identified. Because of this, the search for Elizabeth's remains was called off, but then later there would be further exhumation work carried out inside of the cemetery, and with this the remains of those who were executed during the Terror were buried. There were exhumed. These remains were then taken to the catacombs, and they were interred inside of them. The catacombs today contain the remains of more than 6 million people, and somewhere in this underground maze of ossuaries, the remains and bones of Princess Elizabeth remain, unidentified and mixed in with many other people. Princess Elizabeth turned 30 years old a week before her execution, and she was executed mostly because she was the sister of the king. Some claimed at the time that she supported royalist groups, but she was a woman who was very charitable, and she was different to her brother and her sister-in-law. She was a very religious woman, but like so many during the French Revolution, she lost her head on the guillotine. But somewhere, inside of the catacombs, her remains still exist to this day. In July of 1793, following the first anniversary of the declaration of the French Republic that deposed the French monarchy, the new government ordered a decree that caused chaos. They wanted to punish the former kings and queens who they regarded as tyrants, and they wanted to also wipe the monarchs off the face of the nation and also from the memory of people. With this, the National Convention ordered the desecration and destruction of ancient royal tombs. At the time, the majority of these were inside of the Basilica of St. Denis, close to Paris, which had become a royal mausoleum. With this, groups raided the church and they stole the coffins of the former kings and queens. Also stolen were the visceral urns of the former monarchs. These contained the hearts and entrails of them, which had been cut out of their bodies following their death. The crypts were opened and the remains were taken out of the chapel, and they were dumped in large trenches which had been dug up. The corpses were thrown into these pits, and then the revolutionaries threw quicklime solution onto the bodies to decay them and to then dissolve the corpses quicker. Later, in 1817, the briefly restored monarchy sought to return the remains to the Basilia, and they could only find the lower parts of 3 corpses and the fragments of 158 members of the royal family were later placed inside of ossuaries inside of the crypt. There was very little left of the former kings and queens of France, but inside of the churches there were further desecration as monuments were stolen and smashed, and there was a huge amount of damage. It was an attack on the old order which had been overthrown, and some who witnessed the exhumations and the desecration were even shocked by what they saw. It was a symbol to end the monarchy and an attempt to wipe those from history, and one man who witnessed the events claimed that God would annihilate an entire race and scattered its buried ancestors, and he believed that this was what had previously been warned about in the Bible. The exhumations had been little documented over the years. They were spoke about a lot at the time, and they were a rather important event. The exhumations were performed whilst many officials looked on, and whilst a large crowd made up of many people from the former monks of the chapel to the staunch revolutionaries looked on. The corpses were removed from the sarcophagi inside of the upper church and then taken from the coffins. There was a brief examination to see what state the remains were in, and it was claimed that the majority of the ancient dynastic monarchs' corpses had been reduced to ash, but the later kings and queens of France had been well preserved, but there were some who, despite the embalming process occurred, were in a bad way. The Bourbon monarchs were known for being in a state, and it was said that the putrefied bodies of some emitted a malodorous black vapour that sickened workers before it was checked with vinegar and burnt saltpetre. Inside of the central Bourbon crypt, one of the first coffins opened and broken into was that of King Henry IV. Under the light of torches, the corpses were lifted out of the coffin, and the remains were said to have been very well preserved. It was classed as a miracle, and a cast was taken of his face, showing the deceased king's face with his beard full, his eyes shut, and his face looking as if he died just days before. The corpse of Henry IV was then briefly inside of the choir before it was dumped into the trench outside. There was one corpse which was left alone, though. This was that of King Louis XIV, Supreme's commander, Henry de la Tour d'Avrigny. He was considered at the time the greatest general, and his coffin was opened as the crowd wanted to pay their respects to him. His body was said to have been odourless and intact, and a drawing was made of his body. It had been wrapped in a shroud, and this was uncovered, and it showed the brutal wound that he had died from, a cannonball being shot into his stomach. But the sight of his body stirred up some patriotism along the revolutionaries. There were a number of pieces of the remains of the former monarchs taken. People pulled teeth from the dead and then later tried to sell them. One man who saw the chaos claimed that I had the pleasure of touching these venerable remains. I took his hands with a certain respect that I could not resist, as true a republican as I am. He later saw a soldier who lifted up one of the corpses and then cut a lock off the red beard. Things became violent inside of the crypts because of the anger that the kings and queens represented at the time. A woman approached one of the corpses and swore at it, and then kicked it, which was so brutal that it was knocked from the plinth where it was placed. The coffin of Marie de Medici, the second wife of Henry IV, was opened, and some bones were found inside of muddy water or liquid. and 2 workers scooped them out, and then insults were thrown at her remains for the rest of the day. People pulled pieces of her hair from her skull and distributed them, and they then turned to the body of Anne of Austria. Her casket was opened, and they found her putrefied body, which was wrapped in a thick red cloth. This was then displayed. Some people inside of the local area even began to collect royal voyagers' parts, and one man had taken a section of St. Louis's skull, the teeth of King Henry III, and the leg of Catherine de' Medici. 21 coffins had been broken into on the 16th of October 1793, and the remains were then thrown into a pit. One eyewitness claimed most of the bodies were decaying. A foul-smelling, thick black vapour was released, which they desperately tried to dispel with vinegar and powder that they had taken the precaution of burning, which did not prevent the workmen from feeling unwell and feverish, but without consequence. In total, 46 kings, 32 queens, and members of the royal family, totalling 170 people, had their tombs smashed open, coffins cracked open, and their bodies exhumed. All of them then had their bodies dumped unceremoniously inside of trenches outside of the church, and one trench was for the Valois and the other was for the Bourbons. A huge crowd gathered to witness the burial of the bodies, and the lime was poured into the grave to dissolve the remains quicker, but also to keep the smell down as the bodies stank. Later, the Basilia of St. Denis was reconsecrated, and as mentioned, the remains were attempted to be returned to the grave, but it was impossible to do this. The desecration of the royal tombs inside of France was a brutal and rough event, one which shocked and horrified many people, but also the corpses of a British king, James II, was targeted, and his corpse was taken away and dealt with, despite him not being a French king. No nation on earth went to the extremes that the French did to destroy the bodies of the kings and queens that reigned over them. It was a harrowing event. King Louis XVI was publicly executed on the 21st of January 1793 at the Place de la Révolution in Paris. His trial had concluded 4 days before, and it was stated that he was to be convicted of high treason, and he was condemned to death by a simple majority. Charles Henry Sanson, who was the High Executioner of the First French Republic, had to be convinced to be the man who would take the king's head. But on the morning of his execution he woke up early, and he was helped to be dressed by his valet before he met with an Irish priest named Henry Essex Edgeworth. The king made his final confession and heard his last mass, and was given communion. But then Louis was advised by the priest to avoid a final farewell to his children, as it would be too heartbreaking, and then a carriage had arrived to pick him up. Final arrangements were sorted out as to what to do with the king's last belongings, and he then sat in the carriage that left the temple at 9 o'clock with his priest and a number of guards. The carriage for more than an hour travelled with drummers playing along the journey to drown out any support for the king, and a cavalry force also made its way with the carriage, and they had their sabres drawn. 80,000 men at arms stationed to keep the crowd in control. There were talks of a last-minute rescue mission for the king, as in the neighbourhood of Rue de Clergy, a baron and supporter of the royal family had summoned 300 royalists to try and help the king escape. He was to be hidden in a house, but eventually the rebellion and attempt failed, and 3 men were killed in this. But at 10, the carriage containing Louis XVI arrived at the Place de la Révolution, and it came to a stop close to an area where the scaffold had been made, and on this guillotine was placed. This area was also surrounded by guns and drums, and many in the crowd were armed, and they had pikes and weapons, but the king was then helped from the carriage. And he was then led up the scaffold, and following this the executioner, Charles Henry Sansom, approached the king and asked his assistants to bind the king's hands together. The king at the first instance refused to allow this, and then he gave over as his handkerchief was used instead of a rope, and the executioners then cut the king's hair roughly and also removed the collar of his shirt. They did this to try and ensure that the guillotine blade would slice through his neck in a quick and rapid manner without any issues. After this, Louis tried to speak to the crowd, but he was drowned out by the drum roll that was ordered, and then the king was strapped to a wooden board. He was then slid under the guillotine blade, and Sanson then released the blade, and this then took the king's head off. One witness claimed that the blade did not cut the neck, but instead went through the back of his skull and into his jaw. It was an instant and brutal death. And then the executioner picked the king's head up from the basket and showed it to the crowd. There were some reports that he then dropped this into the crowd and that the guards then rushed to it and dipped their handkerchiefs in his blood. The executioner's account would state, "Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution and asked Sanson why the drums had stopped beating. He came forward to speak, but there were shouts to the executioner to get on with their work. He was strapped down. He exclaimed, 'My people, I die innocent.' Then, turning towards his executioner, Louis XVI declared, 'Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French.' The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants of Sanson showed the head of Louis XVI to the people, whereupon a huge cry of "Vive la nation! Vive la République!" arose, and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. But this was not the end of the king's story, as his body and remains were then taken to the Madeleine cemetery, where they were then buried quickly and hastily. One witness said of this, "Shortly afterwards, the body of Louis was brought to the cemetery by a detachment of gendarmes on foot, who confirmed that the body was entire with all of its limbs, the head being separate from the trunk. We noted that their hair had been cut behind the head and that the corpse was without neckerchief, coat or shoes. It was wearing a shirt, a quilted waistcoat, grey breeches and a pair of grey silk stockings. Thus dressed, the body was placed in a coffin which was lowered into the ditch. This was immediately filled in. All was carried out in accordance with the orders of the Executive Council of the French Republic. However, the body of the king would be exhumed. In 1814, the debate emerged about how possible this was, and the exhumation began on the 18th of January 1815. The former gravedigger took part, and the Queen's remains would be found on the first day, and King Louis XVI would be found the day after. Marie Antoinette, Louis's Queen's body, was found rather easily, but the search for the king was not as easy. A deep trench was dug near the wall, and then the workers found several pieces of board from a coffin before they came across the skeleton of a man who had lost his head and who had wounds to his skull. His head had been placed between his legs when buried, but despite no clothing being found, the witnesses claimed that they had found the remains of the king. They were completely convinced that this was King Louis XVI. Further officials confirmed this, and then their remains were transferred into a lead coffin. There has been some doubt as to whether this was the correct location, but the location was confirmed to have been roughly in the correct spot as to where the king was buried. The body was to be buried 12 feet down and covered in quicklime, and the remains of the king had been damaged by this, and the body was found at the correct depth. A further search did take place in the area at the same depth to make sure they had the king's remains, and there were not any other remains nearby. But the plan was to now bury the remains of the king along with his Queen Marie Antoinette in a more dignified manner, and in a place befitting their royal status. The Madeleine cemetery had become too full, and because of this it had been closed. The bodies were then taken to the Basilica of St. Denis, and one eyewitness then recounts the service that took place for the king. It was said, "Upon reaching the church of St. Denis, the bodies were taken from the car by the guards de la Marche and carried into the church, where they were received by the clergy and presented by the Bishop of Carcassonne, the Bishop of Aire. They were then placed upon a lofty tomb of state in the midst of the choir. Monsieur, after retiring for a few minutes, entered the church and was followed by the Duke of Angoulême, the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Orleans, and the Prince of de Conde, who occupied the stalls on the right nearest the altar. The Duchess of Orleans, the Duchess of Bourbon, and Mademoiselle of Orleans entered the opposite stalls. Next to the princes sat the Duke of Dalmatia, the Duke of Reggio, and the court Bartholomew and M. Lane, whom the king had appointed to support the pole when the coffin was carried to the vault. The other stalls were occupied by deputations from the Court of Cassation, the Court of Ecom, the Council of the University, the Cour Royal, the Municipality, and the Tribunal de Première Instance. The choir was filled by the great officers of the king's household, the officers of the princes' households, His Majesty's ministers, the high personages appointed to form part of the procession, the marshals and peers of France, the deputies of the departments, the grand crosses of the Order of the Major General and staff of the National Guards, the governor of the 1st Military Division and his staff, and a great number of generals and other military officers. The governess of the royal children, the ladies-in-waiting upon her late Majesty, and the ladies-in-waiting upon the Duchess of Angoulême sat upon the benches near the coffins. 400 young ladies of the Maison Royale de Saint-Denis were seated in the front of the altar. When all these attendants had taken their place, the service commenced. The princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master and Master of Ceremonies, and their assistants, approached the altar to present their offerings, after which a funeral oration was delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. The absolution having been pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the royal vault, into which Monsieur and 2 princes, his sons, descended and prostrated themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Salutes of artillery were fired at the moment when the procession set out from Paris, during the service of St. Denis, and when the bodies were lowered into the vault. The execution of the King of France was a brutal and barbaric moment in France, but the discovery and reburial of his body decades later was also a shocking moment. He was a man who was considered the scourge of France, with his apathy for the suffering of his people, but today he lays to rest in a tomb that is more befitting of his title as a royal, rather than laying in a grave with no marker.